Today I'd like to start talking about verbs. The verb structure is perhaps the most complicated part of our ontology. So to see the ontology again, we click on the menu at the top left, Ontology and Lexicon, then select Ontology, and then go over to Source Events and Target Verbs. So again, we try to use semantic or meaning-based concepts, so we call these events, and those are normally expressed as verbs. So when we do that, again, we get a list on the left, shaded in yellow. These are the source concepts. On the right, we have the analyzer words, which are based on English, so they look like English. If I switch to another language like Mandarin or Tagalog, then these would be in those languages. Okay, so let's look at some of these words. Now, first of all, notice that some of them, in the third column, you see at the top of the column it says mappings. And so the second row, except, it says it's mapped to number 1. So on the right, you see that's mapped to the target word in the analyzer language, which is kind of like English, except. So except is mapped to except. That makes sense. One thing I wanted to point out is that some of these words don't show mappings, and that probably indicates that they're not being used currently. Now let's look at admire. So if I put the mouse over the fourth column item, which has theta grids at the top, then I can see an example. It says people admire things. If I put it in the fourth column, you can see it says to admire something. Now I can't see everything that's written there, but if I click in that section and then use the right arrow, I can see the rest of it. To admire something. John admired the painting. Okay, so now I push the left arrow to get back to the original view. So that's a simple case, and you could just write a sentence in phase 1, John admired Mary, or John admired the book. And then our analyzer, if we run that, could convert that into phase 2, and that being a very simple sentence, there wouldn't be any problem. I'd like to show you a source concept that has a lot of different senses. There's no other concept in our, no other word in our ontology that has more senses than the verb to be. So you can see a lot of these. So the second one, if you look over in the fifth column, that's the gives you this description, or in linguistics we say the gloss, says equative. So an example is like, Daniel was a man that Nebuchadnezzar brought from Judah. Or the tree was a shelter for the animals. So you can see that it's saying that something is the same thing that's mentioned in the last part of the sentence. This second one, class membership, John is a human. So it's showing that John is in that group of humans. This next one, it says predicative. Now remember, in terms of adjectives, we were talking about the adjective being used as a predicate. That's when you say something is something. And the example you can see over here in the description is John is tall. Now, for most of these cases, you don't have to worry about how you write this in the phase one, the English-based representation. You can say John is tall, John was a man, and often the analyzer will get that right when it converts into phase two, and if it doesn't, you can fix it. There will be some cases where it will need some adjustment. There are some cases where you write things a little bit differently than it seems like. So if you say John was from Syria, then it will substitute the birthplace form for be. And so it will get rid of that from. So you write it with the from, but normally you don't have to worry about things like that. So now let's look at some other words. Okay, accuse. To accuse someone of something. Now, if you hover over the left column item under theta grids, the theta grid, that's a linguistic jargon term, and it just means the argument structure. So associated with this verb, there are arguments. And when we hover over, we can see the arguments. So under theta grid in this white box, you see agent-like NP, that means noun phrase. Second, patient-like NP, or noun phrase. And the third argument is a patient proposition. Now, in these boxes here, these arguments are mandatory for this sense of accuse. If they were not mandatory, you'd see them showing up in parentheses. Let me go down to allow. Okay, if I hover over the fourth column item for allow, you see it says agent-like noun phrase, beneficiary, but that's in parentheses, so that's an optional argument. So you can use allow without that beneficiary argument. Beneficiary is someone you do something for. Okay, so let's go back up to accuse, and it gives an example underneath that says from Daniel 3:8, the astrologers accuse some Jews of not bowing to the statue. So accuse has the patient argument is the one accused, the agent-like argument is the one who is doing the accusing, and the patient proposition is the accusation, what is the person's being accused of doing. Turns out that if you write the sentence like this, John accused Mary, left bracket, Mary eating food, right bracket, the analyzer will correctly interpret that sentence. The analyzer isn't perfect, and sometimes you need to make corrections, but that will come out with the right way of expressing it. Okay, let's look at agree. There's more than one sense of agree here. The first one, you can see it has an agent-like noun phrase and a patient-like noun phrase. And the example is, the official agreed with Daniel. The second one, it says an agent-like noun phrase and a patient proposition. So the example is, the man agreed to buy the land. And you could write it like that, except you have to put to buy the land in brackets. And another one here, this is another sense. Abimelech agreed with Abraham that Abraham dug the well. So in other words, you're agreeing with someone that something happened. So the way you'd write that in phase 1 is Abimelech agreed with Abraham, left bracket, for the proposition, the subordinate clause, left bracket, that Abraham dug the well, right bracket. So sometimes you can use these theta grid or argument structures in order to figure out how to write what's allowed. You figure out what the senses are that you can use, and also it can help you to know how to write the sentence in the phase 1. So one last example, want, the verb want. So suppose you want someone to do something. Okay, so that's this sense A of want. If you go in the description or gloss, it says to desire that someone else do something. John wants Mary to go to class. And if you get good at this, you can see that actually you can see the proposition structure from the letters here. That first A is an agent-like noun phrase, and the H is the subordinate clause proposition, the patient proposition. So if we hover the mouse over that fourth column, the theta grid, we see the argument structure. We need an agent-like noun phrase and a patient proposition. And there's an example. Nebuchadnezzar wanted these men to serve him. So you might wonder whether, well, should I write it as Nebuchadnezzar wanted these men, left bracket, to serve him, right bracket, or Nebuchadnezzar wanted, left bracket, these men to serve him, right bracket. Well, this shows that if you look down here just above that English sentence, it shows you Nebuchadnezzar want and then left bracket patient proposition, patient, so the man serve Nebuchadnezzar. So what that means is, I'm going to switch to Word. Okay, it means that you should write it like this second sentence here. I, Paul, want, left bracket, you, people, paren, to love God, right bracket. Not, I, Paul, want you, left bracket, to love God. Because everything that Paul wants should be in that proposition. Okay, well, like I said, verbs are probably the most complicated part of the ontology, but it's really useful to see what kind of sentences you can build to look at the ontology, and then you can see these senses, and by either looking at the letters or hovering with the mouse, you can see the arguments that are valid for each sense. Okay, that's all for today.